Thank you for tuning in to this virtual lecture. It's a real pleasure to speak to you, albeit online rather than in person. And it's a particular pleasure to speak about the life and times of Winston Spencer Churchill. I'm a great admirer of Winston Churchill, and I'm also connected to him by name. And my name, Spencer, was chosen for me by my grandfather, a World War II veteran who was a tremendous admirer of Churchill in the war, and chose the name for me when I was still in the womb. So it's a real pleasure to be able to talk about one of my great heroes, and in some ways, my namesake. And for this talk, I want to take you back 121 years to the year 1899. Queen Victoria had spent 62 years on the British throne. The British Empire was at its height. The scramble for Africa, this quest between European powers to colonize Africa, was raging across the African continent. And the British Empire was about to become engaged in one of its most bitter and hardest fought wars, the Boer War. Where was the Boer War fought? It was fought in South Africa, in southern Africa. And as this map shows you, you can see British possessions in South Africa on the eve of the war, surrounding these orange countries in the centre. And those orange countries were the Boer states of Transvaal to the north and Orange Free State to the south. The Boers were better known as Afrikaners at the time, and they were descendants of Dutch colonists who'd arrived in South Africa in the 1600s, had settled there for centuries until eventually taken over by the British Empire in the early 1800s. The Boers and the British Empire did not see eye to eye. They did not share language, they did not share legal systems, and they regarded one another with hostile eyes. The Boers had sought out their own homelands in South Africa, in eastern South Africa, founding Transvaal and Orange Free State in the 1840s. And from that point, they had warred almost constantly with the British. Indeed, the Boers defeated the British in the 1880s in the First Boer War and secured their independence. But the British were not willing to allow the Boers to rest. And this thirst for Boer territory reached its height when enormous gold and diamond fields were discovered in the Boer territories in the mid-1880s. From that point on, war between the two powers was almost inevitable. Britain would not let these states rest. And it finally broke out in October 1899. Transvaal and Orange Free State were two of the smallest countries in the world at the time. They were agrarian republics with relatively small populations and limited heavy industry. Facing the entire might of the British Empire, it seemed like the war would soon be over. It was not to be. And one of the main reasons this was not to be the case was the nature of the Boers themselves. There's a picture here of a group of Boer fighters posing for the camera that's been colorized by a modern historian. The Boers were rugged individualists. Transvaal and Orange Free State was somewhat similar to the Wild West of the 1880s, pioneer country full of frontiersmen, hard men who carved out their own homesteads in what was essentially an untamed land. The Boers were individualists, but in times of war, they would come together to protect their territory. The Boers did not have a formal army. When a national emergency arose, the Boer states would summon volunteers, and every man who could ride and shoot was expected to assemble in a nearby village. They were told to bring a firearm with them, a horse, and rations for between 5 and 10 days. They would then elect their own officers, and they would ride into battle. The Boers had three great advantages. Firstly, they had a great culture of marksmanship and rifle sports. The rifle was a symbol of independence in South Africa, and it was a necessity for independence too. Many Boers hunted for their food, and they needed the weapons to fend off attacks from hostile natives. Secondly, the Boers were a horse-borne society. The vast distances in South Africa meant the horse was the main mode of transportation. Many Boers were excellent riders, and their horses were native to South Africa, hardy pony mounts that could ride for long distances on limited food. And finally, the Boers had an intimate knowledge of the terrain and the countryside of South Africa. They were proud of their independence, and they were tough outdoorsmen. They knew how to ride hard and find shelter when necessary. Boer units were called a commando. Commando had no particular significance in the Afrikaans language. It was similar to saying a regiment or a unit in English. But it would go on to take on a much different meaning in English. In 1940, when then Prime Minister Winston Churchill founded Britain's very first special forces, the Commandos, an elite raiding formation designed to land behind German lines and cause havoc. And he chose the name Commando in tribute to the Boer commandos that had fought against him in South Africa. And I think there can be no greater tribute to the toughness of the Boers in this war than the fact that Churchill, as we will see, a veteran of this war, named Britain's Special Forces after the Boers themselves. And to this day, Royal Marine Commandos remain an elite unit within the British Army. But this all lay in the future. In October 1899, few believed the Boers would prove much opposition to the might of the British Empire. Winston Churchill was one of these. He was just 24 in October 1899 when the war broke out. He'd spent 6 years in the army between 1893 and 1899 as a cavalryman, and he'd seen incredible adventures and action in that 6-year period. He'd been under fire in Afghanistan, in Cuba, and he'd taken part in one of the last great cavalry charges in British history in the Sudan, where he'd found himself in the very front line fighting for his life and only escaped intact due to his skills as a horseman and as a pistolier. His fame as a soldier was not the only thing that he was known for. His real talent had emerged in 1895 when he became a war journalist. His reports from the front line scintillated the British public. He had a natural penmanship, an eye for detail, and an eye for what the public wanted. By 1899, he was the world's highest paid war correspondent, and his reports were in tremendous demand from newspapers, periodicals, and magazines. Indeed, when the Boer War broke out, he negotiated what to that point was the biggest ever war correspondence fee with the British newspaper, the Morning Post. Winston quickly leapt aboard a ship heading towards South Africa, and within a month after the outbreak of war, he had landed in the country, eager to see action, eager to report on what was happening, and eager to get, in his words, a whiff of cordite as he got close to the front line. Now, Winston was not in the army. He'd resigned earlier in that year to pursue war correspondence. But notice that when he arrived in South Africa, he could not resist dressing himself as a soldier. Now, this is by no means an orthodox British Army uniform, but to an untrained eye, it looks rather like one. The hat is a bit of a giveaway. No British officer would wear a hat like that in South Africa, but the rest of it was very similar to British Army wear. He also carried a pistol and would travel around with soldiers. So he looked very much like a soldier. He could not resist the trappings of dressing like one, and this would come to cost him in the not too distant future. Now, when Winston arrived in South Africa, he'd arrived at, in some ways, a fortunate time. The early battles had taken place and the Boers had largely been victorious, driving back British armies, placing some garrisons under siege and taking control of the war. If Winston had been there from the start, there's a high likelihood he might have been killed or taken prisoner in these early exchanges. But when he arrived, a certain lull had settled over operations. The British had been driven back and were trying to regroup, and the Boers were consolidating their gains. Winston was frustrated. He wanted to see a full-scale, full-pitch battle, and he wanted to report on it. But during this period of lull, there was little actually to say. But that never discouraged Winston from finding trouble. Winston found himself stationed with this man, Captain Alma Haldane, a tough Scottish officer, only a few years older than Winston, and a man who himself would go on and have a storied and interesting career in the decades that would follow. Captain Haldane was in command of an armoured train, and I'll show you more of that armoured train in just a moment. He was stationed in a small garrison town and largely had been given orders to keep things quiet, patrolling to secure British lines, but not pressing on too far. This did not satisfy Winston Churchill. He wanted action, and he persuaded Haldane, or harangued him according to some accounts, to take a risk, to take the armoured train beyond British lines and to move it into what was then Boer-controlled territory, essentially looking for trouble. Winston was desperate to see some action, and an adventure on an armoured train seemed like the perfect way to generate an exciting news story. Now, Haldane was in a difficult position with Churchill. On one hand, if you did well by Churchill, his reports back to Britain, read by millions of readers, could well elevate your reputation to untold heights. On the other hand, if you offended Churchill or disappointed him in some way, Winston was by no means reticent in criticising people in the press. And so Haldane was in a difficult position. If he supported Winston and it went well, it could be the making of his career. If he opposed Winston, Winston might well damage his career with negative reports which cast aspersions upon his bravery. And for a young officer, ambitious as Haldane was, it was not a difficult choice to make. He allowed Winston to persuade him into taking the armoured train onto a dangerous and daring patrol, a ride through Boer territory where Winston would accompany him. Here's an artist's impression of this armoured train. Now, the artist hasn't got everything quite right, but the basic details are there. You can see that the engine is in the centre of the carriages. You can see the armoured compartments front and back. The armour-plated sides were actually taller than they're portrayed here. They were above head height, with loopholes cut between the armoured plates to allow soldiers to fire out. This weapon at the front, it's portrayed rather as a machine gun here, was actually a form of artillery piece, an old-fashioned muzzle-loading cannon manned by sailors from HMS Tartar who were on board. Other details, though, are largely correct. The train had about 120 infantrymen, some naval crewmen to man the cannon, and some civilian engineers to fix breakdowns. Churchill and Haldane rode in this train as it ventured beyond British lines and into Boer territory. And Churchill's eagerness to see action found expression by the fact that he was not satisfied to simply stand in the armoured compartment. He couldn't get a good enough view. Churchill wasn't a tall man, and so he insisted that a crate be brought for him so he could stand on top of it and peer directly over the armoured side. And this man here, I like to think, might well be a representation of Winston Churchill peering over, even at risk of being shot as he did so. It didn't take long for this patrol to run into trouble. Boer scouts spotted the train coming, and for the Boers, this was a gift. An armoured train without any kind of escort venturing into their territory was simply demanding to be ambushed. Very quickly, the Boers reacted and set up an ambush point. And the ambush was a classic. Artillery pieces on a hill would open fire on the train in the expectation the train would increase speed to avoid them. As it rounded a corner, a number of boulders would be rolled in front of it, and the train would be going too fast to stop. It would collide into them and be derailed, and then the ambush would truly be sprung. Winston was very excited to see Boer horsemen in the distance, but seemed to have had no idea about the danger that he and Haldane were riding into. Shortly after 2:30 in the afternoon, the ambush took place. Boer artillery opened fire, caused the train to increase speed straight into a boulder roadblock. The front two carriages were crushed. The first carriage was knocked clean off the rails and fell onto the ground. The second was buckled badly but remained blocking the engine's route. The carriages behind the engine crashed into one another, flinging soldiers to the ground, injuring many of them. And just as the ambush train as the soldiers had chance to restore their balance and get to their feet, the ambush really broke free. Gunfire, artillery fire rained down upon the soldiers and upon the train, and with the engine blocked off by the buckled carriage, there was nowhere to go. Haldane reacted quickly. He gathered together his remaining infantry, put them into position, and tried to return fire to beat down the Boers. Meanwhile, Churchill ran to the front of the train, gathering some of the civilian engineers and some soldiers, and he tried to move the buckled truck so that the engine could escape. This was done under heavy fire from many different directions. Churchill's luck was remarkable at this stage. A soldier working next to him had his arm blown clean off by an artillery shell, and another artillery shell plunged into the ground just in front of Churchill. It was a wet day, it was raining. The shell buried itself in the soft earth only a yard from Churchill's feet and detonated, but detonated harmlessly, only covering him with dirt and clods. Could have been very different for Winston. Bullets echoed around the ruined train, gunfire blazing from all sides, and in this maelstrom of fire, Churchill and the men managed to eventually move the truck, the damaged truck, from the rails and push it to one side. It took about 20 to 30 minutes under fire for this to take place. But disaster, as the engine tried to move forward, it found that although the men had moved the truck to one side, enough of it was jutting out to block the path of the engine and it couldn't get past. The Boers, recognizing their prize was about to slip away, closed in for the kill. The train driver, seeing this, put on full steam, maximum speed from the train, and simply barged the carriage out of the way. The engine was loose, it was moving again. But what had happened to the carriages behind it? Unfortunately, in the crash, the coupling had broken. There was no way to tow the carriages along with the engine. Only the engine was mobile. All the other carriages had to be abandoned. Winston and Haldane loaded up as many wounded men as they could onto the engine itself, about 50 men in total. By now, Haldane had lost a third of his 120 men killed and wounded. The remaining soldiers had to try and run alongside the engine, and Haldane gave the orders for double time and his infantry tried to run alongside the engine as it pulled away, using it for cover from the Boers, who were now closing in. But the Boers were not going to be denied their prize. They rained fire onto the engine, which by now was riddled with bullets. Water was spraying out of its tank. Its funnel had been riddled with bullets, so steam was escaping in strange ways. And the driver, who had a bad head wound, was particularly panicked when his engine caught fire from a Boer artillery shell. He increased speed and he accelerated away from Winston, Haldane, and the soldiers. They couldn't keep up. Haldane turned, he got a small knot of men around him. The Boers were closing in. Haldane realized he was surrounded and that to fight on would simply result in everybody being killed and wounded. He surrendered the remainder of his soldiers. But Winston was not prepared to surrender. Instead, seeing Haldane give in, Winston ran. He ran down the rail tracks, desperately trying to catch up with the train. He couldn't do it. Two Boers on foot pursued him. Both opened fire. One bullet winged just to the left of Winston's ear. A bullet on his right struck the tracks and drew sparks. Realizing that he was being shot at and in grave danger, Winston dived off the rail tracks into a ditch that ran alongside the rail line. He continued to run down this. The two Boers followed him, and as Winston looked to his right, he could see a Boer horseman was riding round to cut off his retreat. Winston had nowhere to go, and so he made a fateful decision. He decided he would rather fall fighting than surrender meekly. And so he reached for his pistol, which he had on his belt, so he could try and shoot his way out of trouble. Unfortunately, he'd left his pistol on the engine as it pulled away. He'd put it down when he was helping to load wounded onto the engine, and now it was disappearing over the horizon. Although this seemed like bad luck, this probably saved Winston's life. Although he was a very skilled pistolier, there was no prospect that he could possibly shoot his way past three Boers. And so instead, unarmed, he was forced to raise his hands and was taken prisoner by the mounted Boer who rode across to him. And this picture shows his act of surrender. Note some artistic license here. The rail engine is in the background. In fact, it was disappearing fast over the horizon at the point that Winston was taken prisoner. A miserable, heartbreaking moment for Winston. He was devastated, and his devastation only increased as he, Haldane, and the survivors were marched 6 hours to the north, deep into Boer lines, before being loaded up on a train and shipped to the Boer capital of Pretoria in Transvaal, where he was to be placed into prison. Winston tried to talk his way out of trouble. He argued to his Boer captors that he was a journalist and was not a soldier, and therefore could not be treated as a prisoner of war. But here, that unorthodox uniform he insisted on wearing became a problem. The Boers pointed out, not incorrectly, that he was dressed like a soldier and he had been acting like a soldier, including firing his pistol at Boer troopers during the ambush of the armoured train. Even more than this, as one Boer captor said to him, "It is not every day we capture the son of a lord," a reference to Winston's English father, Lord Randolph Churchill. There was to be no escape for Winston, and he would become a celebrity prisoner of the Boers. Here's a photo of him with fellow officers who've been captured, fellow officers and soldiers captured during the armoured train incident. And I think it's a very evocative photo. You can see Winston on the far right. Winston was given to great brooding moods throughout his life, and he has that air about him. He had his hands tucked behind his back. A common trait of Winston was to tuck his hands into his back pockets when he was thinking, and he's definitely lost in thought, I think, as he's being paraded for the Boer propagandists here. Winston, and Haldane for that matter, were imprisoned in a converted boarding school in Pretoria, the capital of Transvaal, and Winston hated being placed in prison. For a man as energetic and active as Winston Churchill, to be placed in prison was akin to the most appalling thing that could happen. All he could do was exercise. He could not bring himself to read. He found no ability to write. He was utterly frustrated. In his own words, the hours seemed to crawl by like paralytic centipedes. Conditions were relatively benign, and he had plenty of food, albeit bland. He had an opportunity to walk around the yard and exercise, but there was no opportunity to do anything else. And Winston was terrified that he was going to spend the rest of the war locked in this prison camp. He celebrated a very unhappy 25th birthday in prison at the end of November. And this incident seems to have convinced him that he had to get out of this prison. He could not stay here. This was too much. He had to find freedom. He and Haldane began to observe the Boer patrols around the prison. And they observed that about 7:30 p.m. each day, there was a changeover between sentries, which opened a possibility of escaping over a wall into some bushes not too far away. Over the coming weeks, Haldane and Churchill spent a lot of time planning how they could get away. It all hinged on that moment of leaping over the wall at 7:30 when the guards changed. Finally, on the 12th of December 1899, Churchill and Haldane and another man called Sergeant Brocky all decided this was the moment they were going to take to actually escape, and Winston's great escape was about to begin. It immediately began with controversy. Winston and Haldane were discussing the exact details of their plan as 7:30 rolled around, and as the clock struck that hour, Winston clambered over the wall, bounced to the path on the other side, and then dashed into some bushes. He waited for Haldane and Brocky to join him, but just at that moment, the sentries unexpectedly changed their patrol patterns, meaning that Haldane could not jump over the wall without being spotted. What exactly happened next is somewhat controversial. Haldane later said that he gave Winston a signal that it was okay to go on and that there was no possibility of Haldane getting across the wall. But Sergeant Brocky claimed for years afterwards that Winston had abandoned he and Haldane, and indeed this led to a libel case some 10 years later, which Winston won with the aid of Haldane's evidence. With Haldane and Brocky unable to follow him, Winston had to go alone, and he had precious few resources. Most of the provisions and the map and the compass were in Haldane's possession. Winston had 4 blocks of chocolate, or 4 slabs of chocolate, I should say, so about £75 in money to be used as bribes, and nothing else except a floppy Boer hat, which he'd managed to pilfer from the prison camp chaplain, which gave him some form of disguise. He was in the middle of the Boer capital, a prosperous and wealthy city at the time, mining city at the time. He had no ability to speak the Afrikaans language, and he had no real idea where he was going, other than an idea of going east to eventually reach neutral Portuguese East Africa. He wandered through Pretoria with his hat pulled low for about 3 hours, until eventually he came across the rail station at the edge of the city. Seeing a train that was heading east, he jumped aboard it into a goods carriage as pictured here and rode the rails towards Portuguese East Africa, 320 miles away across hostile territory. He spent some time sleeping in this carriage. He ate some of his chocolate, and then waking up with a terrible thirst, he'd not been able to take any water with him. He looked out of the carriage and saw he was passing through an area of streams and small ponds. He therefore leapt from the moving train, always a risky proposition, and was able to slake his thirst at these waterways. But he was in the middle of nowhere. The train rumbled away. He had a rough idea that he needed to continue heading east, and without a compass, he had to navigate by the stars. He wandered perhaps 20 miles in a generally easterly direction, his only companion a large vulture who followed him with interest, and according to Churchill, whose stomach kept making the most awful gurgling noises as he eyed up the young Winston. After some 20 miles of wandering east, by now reaching exhaustion, having eaten his chocolate, realizing he couldn't rely on finding water, Winston needed something, needed a break. Ahead of him was a small mining town, and he could see a farmhouse on the edge of it. Deciding he would try and bribe his way to safety, he walked up to the farmhouse and knocked on the door. An Afrikaans voice shouted back at him, asking who it was. Churchill had no ability to speak Afrikaans, and so replied in English. There was a pause, then the door flew open, and the man on the other side was an Englishman, John Howard, who worked in the mine. And as Howard said, he was the only Englishman who lived within 20 miles of that point. Every other person in the town was an Afrikaner and would probably have given Winston up. Howard bundled Churchill into the house, he fed and watered him, and then they 2 of them planned how they would conceal him long enough to smuggle Winston aboard another train. Howard initially hid Winston in his house, but subsequently hid him in a disused mine shaft in a nearby mine. And Howard knew the mine very well, and he reckoned correctly the Boers would not search it. But it was not a very comfortable berth for Winston, who found himself with rats scurrying over him and did his best efforts to read by candlelight. According to Winston, he read Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped during this time, waiting for a train to pass. The Boers very quickly realized that Winston had escaped because Winston told them he was escaping. He'd left them a note in his cell saying that he did not believe they had the right to hold him prisoner, and therefore he felt it was his duty to escape. The Boers didn't see this on the same level, and an enormous manhunt began a mere day after Winston had escaped. And this poster here, offering a £25 reward for Winston Churchill, dead or alive, would become quite famous. Some historians suggest this might be a post-war a post-Boer War invention, but certainly Churchill never had any reason to believe it was a forgery, and other historians believe it was genuine. What's certainly true and not disputed is the Boer police carried out a vigorous search of the area. Very quickly worked out Churchill must have headed east on a train and then started to close in the net. They actually arrived at John Howard's house and searched it. But of course, by then, Winston was in the mines and they did not venture into these disused mine shafts. Instead, they headed east looking for him elsewhere. After several days hiding in the mine, Howard became aware that an eastbound train was heading to Portuguese East Africa. He provisioned Churchill and they smuggled him aboard it as it passed, as it slowed and as it passed through the town. Churchill hid in a freight unit at the very back of it, covered in empty coal sacks. He nearly found himself in trouble even then. This gives an idea of his route before we go on to this. 321 miles from Pretoria in the west to Lourenço Marques, which was the capital of Portuguese East Africa, a neutral country at the time. Churchill boarded the train here at a town called Witbank, and just on the border of Portuguese East Africa, the train was stopped by Boer police, and they actually boarded Churchill's carriage and they searched it. Churchill, however, had buried himself under empty sacks at the very edge of the carriage, and they did not press this far, but a tense moment undoubtedly followed. Then the Boer police, satisfied, they left the train and it rumbled into neutral East Africa, Portuguese East Africa. But even when he arrived at Lourenço Marques, he was not completely out of the woods. He disembarked and he reported himself to the British Embassy. But there were plenty of Afrikaners and Boers who lived in Portuguese East Africa, not to mention those who sympathised with the Afrikaner cause. There was a real worry that these people might storm the British Embassy, drag Churchill out and hand him back over to the Boer authorities. And so the embassy actually summoned British citizens living in Lourenço Marques to come and protect the embassy, bringing weapons just in case a mob tried to capture Churchill at the 11th hour. And when Churchill was ready to be returned back to South Africa by sea, you can see the route he took here, he was actually smuggled out in disguise just in case Afrikaners were to try and seize him as he boarded the ship. It was not to be. So Churchill re-arrived in British Durban, or British-controlled Durban down here on the 23rd of December, just before Christmas, following an 11-day escape. Here's a photograph of him not long after he'd arrived back in Durban. A man of the hour. And in the context of what was happening in the Boer at this time, this was a desperately needed good news story for the British Empire. Britain's armies had been defeated repeatedly by the Boers. Indeed, in mid-December, a period took place that was known as the Black Week, where 3 separate British armies were all decisively defeated by the Boers in 3 separate battles. There was very little to celebrate in Britain about the war that Christmas. And so the sudden return of Winston Churchill, complete with a sensational story to tell, and he was a wonderful penman, of course, this was exactly the tonic that the British press needed on the eve of Christmas. A thrilling story where for once the British had something to celebrate. And this would go on to make him one of the most famous men in Britain and ultimately the world. But his adventures in South Africa were not completely over. Nobody would have complained if Churchill had returned home at this point, perhaps to recuperate after his rather daring adventures. But that wasn't Churchill's way. In January 1900, less than a week after or just over a week, I should say, after he had returned from prison, he decided he was going to rejoin the British Army. He joined the South African Light Horse, an elite and daring cavalry unit, and he'd actually fight in the Boer War for the next 6 months, once again risking death, very nearly being killed, trusting to his luck, and having further remarkable adventures before the war ended. And perhaps the most ironic of all was he actually liberated the prison camp where he was held when the British invaded Transvaal in the summer of 1900. But that's a story for another day. For now, I'd be very welcome to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Spencer. Just a reminder to everyone that they can submit questions through the question and answer icon at the bottom of the screen. So we have a few questions. Could you talk a little bit about who the Boers were and where and when they first came to Africa?
Absolutely. The Boers were Dutch colonists who, in the Age of Discovery, the 1600s, They had settled what's now Cape Town. And they'd settled this because the Dutch were doing a great deal of trading in the East Indies, so Indonesia and so forth. And they needed a reprovision station around Cape Horn to allow their ships to make this transit. This is, of course, before the Suez Canal. They'd settled there in about the 1660s. They'd always been a small, quite independent colony. It hadn't really attracted that much immigration from the Netherlands itself, and they were very fiercely independent. By the late 1700s, they had their own language, Afrikaans, literally speaking African. There was a sort of combination of medieval Dutch along with African words and other new creations. They came under British rule in 1806 during the Napoleonic Wars. Britain seized Cape Town to protect its shipping from potential French raiders. And they were ruled by the British as part of British South Africa until the 1830s, when all sorts of clashes between them, the British and the Boers politically over religion, over legal issues, and above all else over the abolition of slavery, forced the Boers to migrate in what's called the Great Trek, a great overland migration from Cape Town in the west to Transvaal and Orange Free State in the east, where they founded their own countries. But of course, the British also expanded east, soon came back into contact with them, and tensions rose from there.
Laurel would like to know, when did Churchill's political career begin? Did it begin after this, and how was this experience formative?
Well, he'd actually tried to enter Parliament in the summer of 1899 before he went to South Africa, and he'd been narrowly defeated, and very disappointed to be narrowly defeated. His political career, though, really took off after he came back from South Africa. So he returned from South Africa in June 1900. He went on a great speaking tour around Britain and the United States, and then he returned and fought his first election and won his first parliamentary seat soon after his return. And as a very famous man and as something of a hero of the empire, it was a huge advantage to him to have had this Boer experience. That was the start of his political career, and he would hold a seat until 1922, when he had his first and in fact only political defeat from that point.
Nancy would like you to speak to the natives, the Native Africans. Did they align themselves with any particular side, and what was their general condition?
Well, excuse me. Natives that were living in the Boer republics were very poorly treated. They had no franchise, they had no political rights, they lived in slums, and were used as little more than very, very cheap labor, very much looked down upon. And although the British Empire in 1899 was no bastion of liberalism or equality, even the British were shocked at how badly the natives in the Boer republics were treated. That would become a sore point later on. But there were many other native groups, including independent kingdoms such as Zululand, where the Zulu kingdom reigned. Nearly all of the natives were extremely hostile to the Boers. The Boers had warred with them in the 1800s and indeed before, treated them badly, looked down upon them. Strictly speaking, the war was actually billed by both sides as a white man's war. They did not want to involve natives in this war, but both sides soon broke that law. The Boers used native labor as a sort of labor corps, effectively enslaved really at gunpoint and forced to work for the Boers to dig trenches and so on. And the British used black natives as scouts and auxiliaries, paying them and putting them in British uniform. But the attitude of natives towards the Boers was almost uniformly negative.
Shirley would like to know, did Churchill suffer any consequences for his role in driving the train into an ambush?
Well, he was very, very lucky, because he was the general who was actually over in charge, who I haven't introduced to you, a man called Reeves Buller. He was furious when he heard the armoured train had been destroyed and most of the men had been captured or killed. He described Churchill's decision as inconceivable stupidity, which in many ways it was. It was incredibly daring and dangerous. Churchill got away with it because of his escape. If he'd stayed in prison until he was eventually liberated by British soldiers, he probably would have faced very, very serious consequences. But the daring escape and the fact that he was some desperately needed good news at a time when everything else had gone wrong meant he got away with it. Now, there's certainly military men who criticised him, and there was elements in the British press who said that Churchill shouldn't be celebrated for getting himself into trouble. But ultimately, there were far more press people who just liked the good news and the adventurous story. It certainly made better reading than reading about yet another British army gets defeated.
We have a few questions about his family. What did his family think about his exploits?
Well, Churchill had a very complex relationship with his family. As many of you will know, he was a product of an English father and an American mother, once described as part English gentry and half American gambler. And I think you can see elements of this in this current story. By the time he went to war, his father had died. His father died prematurely, and his mother was involved in endless scandals back in the United Kingdom. The more interesting character in this is actually his younger brother, Jack, who we hear very little of. And Jack was a soldier. Actually, later in the Boer War, Winston and Jack would find themselves fighting side by side. Um, Churchill was determined to follow in his father's footsteps, and in some ways to make up for the fact that his parents had never really shown him any love or any affection. In fact, quite the opposite. They treated him quite poorly and be very critical of him throughout his early life. He was determined to sort of make good on the Churchill name, which is a very famous name. Whether his mother expressed much interest in what he was doing in South Africa is another question, but she did take a hospital ship down in South Africa soon after this incident occurred, and ended up treating her own son, Jack Churchill, on her own hospital ship when he was wounded. Certainly Jack approved of Churchill's adventures. He was a similarly adventurous man and a soldier. Whether Jenny, his mother, approved of this, it presupposes that she was less interested in her affairs.
Thank you. We have some questions about wondering what happened to the other prisoners, and did Churchill's relationship with Haldane continue following this escapade?
Well, that's a very good question. Haldane actually escaped from prison himself a month or two after Churchill's escape, following largely the same escape plan that Churchill had used. The difference was that Haldane went with proper provisions and supplies, plus he could speak a little bit of Afrikaans, which helped, and he escaped on a single long train journey that went all the way to Portuguese East Africa in one go. The other prisoners, unfortunately, couldn't escape. After Haldane's escape, security was enormously tightened on the prison, and there were no further breakouts from it. But Churchill actually liberated that prison when he rejoined the army, and he was a cavalryman again. He was one of the liberators and actually opened the gates to the prison to let the prisoners out. A very sweet moment for Churchill, no doubt. Haldane went on. He had a very successful military career, fought very hard in the First World War, became a governor of Iraq, and fought the first modern war in Iraq. Wonder what he made of that. Churchill and Haldane maintained a cordial but never particularly warm relationship. Haldane never criticised Churchill for leading the army training to a disaster, or equally getting out of the prison and leaving Haldane behind. Haldane always said that he gave Churchill the signal so that Churchill would move on. But Haldane was playing quite a clever game, perhaps, because he recognised Churchill had written an awful lot of nice things about him. He praised Haldane's courage, praised his command in action, and this was very good if you were a young up-and-coming officer to have the world's most famous journalist say you were a fine officer. So they remained cordial, but they were never particularly close friends.
Thank you. We have several questions. One from Warren. Did the Boer War lead to the establishment of Rhodesia as a country separate from South Africa? And in general, we have some other questions. What was the conclusion or the consequence of the Boer War?
Well, I'll answer both those in sort of in reverse order. So that the conclusion of the Boer War was eventually, after a very long and bitter guerrilla campaign that cost tens of thousands of lives, the Boers were forced to the negotiating table in May 1902. Their territories occupied. The guerrilla war eventually brought to a bitter halt. A very, very violent and unpleasant war. And what was called the Union of South Africa was formed out of Boer territories and British territories, and this would become formalized in 1910. At that time in 1910, when South Africa became its own country effectively, Rhodesia too became its own independent country. So the two were linked. It was all part of a British system of turning its more distant colonies into what were called dominions, who had a certain degree of self-government. So Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and ultimately South Africa and some of the African colonies too.
We have somebody, Anna, asking, are there any questions about the veracity of Churchill's accounts?
Well, there were at the time, and this would be a source of controversy. Sergeant Brocky, who was going to be the third member of the escape party, he maintained largely for the remainder of his life that Churchill had abandoned Brocky and Haldane. And in Churchill's own account, there is a suggestion that there was some dispute about the exact moment they were to leap over the wall, with Brocky not happy that Churchill had simply leapt over and disappeared. And Brocky claimed that Churchill had abandoned them. This led to a libel case in 1911, which Churchill won with the aid of Haldane's account. One of the interesting things is that for several years, Churchill couldn't give away the name of John Howard, the man who'd sheltered him in the house, because Howard still lived in Boer territory, and there was a real fear of reprisals, should he be named. Eventually, and this is a lovely twist, John Howard left South Africa and he moved back to the UK, and he actually ended up living in the same city, Manchester, which Winston Churchill was the MP for, and met him again back in England in 1904, so they reconnected. But some of the details are rather doubtful. For example, the vulture that followed Churchill, which he's very, very keen on telling us all about in his written accounts. People challenged him on that and said this was unlikely. He insisted that there was a vulture. There's also certain other elements about the extent to which he wandered through Pretoria on his own for 3 hours and so on and so forth. But as he's largely the only witness to this, I'm afraid we don't have competing accounts to compare it against.
Fair enough. Spencer, Christine wants to know, were there other troops, other Commonwealth troops fighting with the British against the Boers?
There were. This was, in many ways, the first British Empire war. Contingents were sent from Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and also British South Africa produced contingents who fought as well. It was the first time that Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand troops had actually fought outside of their continents, fighting in South Africa as part of their own units, commanded by their own officers, wearing their own uniforms. The first time that there'd really been an imperial war. And the experience of this, and these were all volunteers, because the Dominions had very, very small standing armies. So these were volunteers who signed up to go to war. And the tremendous wave of enthusiasm from the Empire when it called upon them in the Empire's hour of need, if you will, laid the groundwork for the Empire responding to British calls for troops in the First World War and again in the Second World War. So this is a pivotal war for the British Empire.
So we just have time for one more question, and I think it will be interesting for you to answer considering your follow-up lecture.
Right, yes.
So we have someone wanting to know, are there any legacies, any lessons learned from this that would help him later in World War II?
I think there's two. One is actually a negative, and I think that Churchill, by this stage, and he'd already had incredible adventures, and he would have more incredible adventures in the 6 months that followed, he had a sense of invincibility. He was willing to trust to his luck a little bit too much, and that would cost him in the First World War, where his career was nearly ruined. He came very, very close to being ruined as a result of the Gallipoli operation. So in some ways, it created a sense of overconfidence. One thing it did do, though, was encourage Churchill's resilience and his unwillingness to ever despair. As for all his frustrations he had in prison, and he had many, and we know because he wrote a lot about them, he never actually gave up. He was frustrated and he was angry, but he was constantly looking for a way to escape. And he constantly believed that there was still the room for him to act and the room for him to make a difference. And Churchill never lost that belief, although at times it wavered during some of the harder moments of his political career. And much of this, I think, was formed during this traumatic 6-week period. He showed that as long as you have the audacity to act, there was always a chance of success. And Churchill paid tribute to that, in fact, after the Second World War. It would repay him very well in 1940 when all seemed lost.
All right. Well, with that, we have to conclude our webinar. So thank you very much.
Thank you.